Okay, well, I'm gonna turn it over to our speaker, and I was asking him in a panic to tell me about his background, which he did tell me that he went to UC Davis as an undergrad. He's now a PhD student, and you're just gonna have to brag on yourself.
Yeah, that's basically it. I mean, I came here for undergrad and didn't get enough Davis, so came back. And yeah, be here for a while longer. I like birding, and that's kind of what got me into, well, I don't know. I don't know what came first. Somehow birding and bird research made their way into my life in undergrad. Huh? Well, technically my department is neurobiology, physiology, and behavior, which isn't really what I do. But that's just because my advisor like randomly lives in that department. I mean, he's like a behavioral endocrinologist. So it kind of, and I might go a little bit that direction too. But I basically his study system that he's worked on since his PhD is Red Crossbill. And even though he started out with behavioral endocrinology, he's worked on them for so long that, you know, he feels comfortable advising me in ecological type questions now relating to Crossbill. That's how I understand our relationship. Anyway, so yeah, I'm going to be talking to you today about some preliminary results from my first field season, first two field seasons now. I had a pilot field season and then another more systematic survey season last summer. And basically, these results are, I think they're of interest to birders because birders are very concerned about all these call types of red crossbills and, you know, what are they? We want to say, like, are they species? Are they subspecies? Should I not even worry about it? And I think they're interesting. So that's why I study them. But I'm not going to tackle exactly their taxonomic status today, but I will address some of the ecological relationships involved, which I think are fascinating. All right, so first I'm going to introduce my study system, which is type 2 and type 5 red crossbills. I'm going to talk about a few hypotheses for why they might exist as two separate types. And then I'm going to go over how the different categories of findings that I have weigh on each of those hypotheses. So basically the North American red crossbill, which isn't even a subspecies itself, it's a whole Arctic species complex, but the North American red crossbill contain 12 vocal types. And they're initially described as incipient species, sister species. This is a figure from the original paper describing them. And they're really cool because they have these incredibly discrete vocal variations. So each one has like a just categorically different call type, even though they sound similar to us because they're very short calls. But if you look at the actual structure of the call itself, you can see they're almost seemingly intentionally distinctive from each other. And then among these, type 2 and type 5, this is the sound of each of them here. They're perhaps the most similar in a lot of ways. So red crossbills basically have long been considered one of the best examples of an adaptive radiation. So like active speciation in birds that's driven by ecological specialization in range overlap, as opposed to separate ranges and then some allopatric speciation. So becoming different because you live in different places. And basically there's very few other examples of that actually, other than the Galapagos finches, very famous example, where there's one common ancestor that diverged into all of these finches, and some of them actually are overlapping in range, and Hawaiian honeycreepers are another classic example. Usually this involves incredible bill specialization and resource-based polymorphism. And so the red crossbill call types are the only reason we consider them potential species as opposed to just dialects or culturally inherited groups is because these call variations they map onto discrete variation in size and bill size. So That's type 2, that's a big one. And type 3 is a small one. And unfortunately, I kind of scaled them up and to look that much bigger, but that's roughly how the difference in size. Unfortunately, though, if you take a picture of one of them, it's hard to discern the bill size exactly from the photo because the bill size is smaller because the whole bird is smaller. So the relative size of the different parts is roughly the same. But unfortunately, it's not like a Ross's goose where even the proportions are smaller. It's like the whole thing is smaller. And then another, so that's type 2 and type 5. That's my study system. And there's one of the ways they're similar is that they have this total range overlap. So this is type 5 range, and this is type 2's range. And you can see that the purple is the core ranges of each. And I would argue actually that the core range of type 5 is even narrower than this. It's basically just the Central Rockies. And so you can see that that's completely encapsulated within the type 2 range. Type 2 is very common across that entire range. And so it really makes you wonder, like, okay, what's going on here? Why do they have total range overlap? There's not a lot of birds that are so closely related, yet they completely overlap each other. And well, there are very closely related birds that completely overlap each other, but not that evolved in sympatry. They always have, generally the pattern is that they evolved because of a geographic barrier, glaciers, rivers, mountains, and then they come back together and they can no longer hybridize. That's the pattern that has driven most of bird diversification. This would be different because you can see the total range overlap very much suggests that that didn't happen. There is a possibility that it did happen, but because of the specifics of crossbill's life history and connection to a key conifer species, or non-key conifer species as well, that would be difficult to envision for crossbills. I won't get into the geographic explanations here. So my field site is starred right there. It's sort of towards the northern end of type 5's range, but really in the center of type 2's range. And then here are some type 2 calls and type 5 calls. Type 2 kind of varies from the unkinged form at left to the kinged form at right. That basically all of them have this shared characteristic of being descending in sound, very husky sounding, fairly low sounding. They kind of have this like choop, 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 choop quality, whereas type 5 has this polyphonic, complex sounding, tinny, high pitched chip, 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 chip. If you live somewhere that has both of them, you would quickly realize that there's two very different sounding groups involved. So yeah, they share their entire ranges, even though they have these distinct sounds. Genetically, also very similar. So there's two different studies on their genetics, basically, of the whole crossbill complex. Both of them resolve type 2 and type 5 as each other's closest relatives, more or less. So in this PCA of genome-wide SNPs, we can see that type 2 and type 5 are pretty much, they parse out, but they're not overlapping, but they're right next to each other. Same thing on this, they resolve a sister taxa on this distance-based phenogram. And so, yeah, they're very closely related genetically. This study didn't even resolve them as monophyletic groups. So they're not even necessarily each other's closest relatives according to this study. Whereas this study does show them as each other's closest relatives. There they are on that one. No. And this is a blown up image from the original article that described them. And you can see their bill depths are nearly the same, 9.3, 9.5, 9.6. And these two specimens are just about the same in terms of bill size, body size. Oh, and interestingly, on this PC2 on this PCA really correlates nicely with that bill depth, which does show type 5 is larger build than type 2. So that's an interesting sort of reversal in that case. Here's a sort of a speculative chart showing some food usage data. This is from the new Finch field guide. I'd recommend it. It's kind of it's an interesting field guide. It blends a lot of like sort of new data about diet. Observe them in your yard and stuff. So basically we can see type 5 at right has these food sources, and all of those occur in type 2 and at about the same rate in the diet. The only difference is type 2 has additional species because it has a larger range. All of these other food sources are in the type 2 column and not the type 5 column because they don't occur in type 5's range. So suggests that there's major diet overlap, but this isn't necessarily based. This is sort of collated from many dispersed observations and isn't really, they're not from direct focused study. And so why do all these call types remain discrete vocal groups despite all this overlap? That's the question that I'm sort of tackling today. And so regardless of whether they're like culturally inherited sort of vocal groups or genetically inherited incipient species, there has to be something that isolate them, right? Like even if they're purely culturally inherited, we would expect it to become just a panmixia if there wasn't some sort of isolating mechanism. And so the key conifer hypothesis is the kind of the going hypothesis right now. It suggests that each call type is specialized to maximize its feeding rate on a single conifer in late winter when there's little to no remaining, or when there's very little remaining seed in the cones. It's a very specific, people mistake this to think that it's just that they're specialized on that conifer, but really it's just that they're specialized on that conifer in like February. And so type 2, ponderosa pine, type 5, lodgepole. And you'll see that because of this key conifer hypothesis, you'll see that in the Clements taxonomy and eBird, the names say the tree after them, which is, I find very misleading because actually this key conifer hypothesis didn't consider any alternative hypotheses when it was published. So it's, and there wasn't really any empirical work to go, there wasn't any field work to back that up really. And so the main ecological predictions of the key conifer hypothesis would be that the habitat selection and diet are going to align closely with that key conifer species in late winter. But let's consider some alternatives. So the rich patch exploiter hypothesis would suggest that the sort of nomadic migrations that crossbills undergo allow them to connect disparate patches of very rich resources. And so they never actually have to ride through that lean period. They're just going to have food all the time. And so then there's perhaps variation in to what extent they do that nomadic migration and variation in that strategy that could provide a diverging, a distinctive ecological distinction between the types. And so that would predict that crossbills will be highly responsive to changes in food availability, highly migratory in most years, and that they'd rarely feed at very low intake rates where they're just eking out an existence. And it's somewhat mutually exclusive with the key conifer hypothesis, at least for some types. And then the summer diet hypothesis is similar to the key conifer hypothesis, but it's more that it's more about the green hard cones in summer before they open, and that the specialization is happening on those. So then we'd expect, of course, that habitat selection and diet are going to be most aligned at that. And then habitat specialization hypothesis is essentially that there's some sort of natal habitat imprinting or some other process that causes them to specialize on a habitat, not necessarily a particular tree to feed on in that habitat. And then I mentioned the historic geographic isolation hypothesis. That would be how all other birds essentially speciate. I'm not really considering that here because I don't have any way to test that in the field. You can only use population genetics to test that. And the population genetics I showed you earlier are totally all over the map and equivocal. It doesn't show any patterning really. And so, yeah, like I said, Galapagos finches, classic example of this ecological divergence. Here, I'll go over the key. So here's a blown up figure from, this is the life cycle, annual cycle of the red crossbill. We've got the cone cycle on the outside. So cones develop in summer, they mature in fall, and then the seeds fall through winter. And then within that, that basically dictates the seasonal cycle of crossbills. So in the center, we have molt. They go through one pre-basic molt per year. And that happens after they start breeding in summer. And then crossbills are incredibly interesting in that they have facultative winter breeding. So a lot of years in an ideal crossbill year, actually, they will breed again starting in late winter and then fledge their young in spring and then migrate again. So that means that there's usually, if everything goes according to plan and they don't have to flee at the end of summer, there's usually one migration per year where that's nomadic and goes any direction until they find a new cone crop and then breed, molt, breed again, and then migrate again to another cone crop. So that's basically the rich patch exploiter hypothesis basically asserts that because of this life history strategy, the nomadic migration in early summer are probably going to be the more limiting time. And actually in winter, most years they're going to be fine because they are so good at finding those new cone crops. Michael?
You're talking about this migration eruption. Are you talking about like, thousands of birds that are in one area all go somewhere else, or is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
The whole, like in the East Coast.
Is there a question?
Oh, so Michael just asked, like, when I'm talking about these movements, am I referring to like the entire population picking up and moving, or more just a subset? Did I get that? Yeah. So, and from a lot of crossbill populations, it is actually, they just won't be there the next year. And other crossbill populations less so. So generally, as you go south, you tend to get more semi-resident crossbills, and you will always have a few crossbills, like in the transverse ranges in Southern California or the Sierra Nevada of California. There's generally crossbills every year, but the numbers go up and down. And whereas if you were in, say, the Eastern Cascades of Washington, one year it would just be like crossbills everywhere, and then it might be like 5, 6, 7, 8 years until that happens again. So.
Type 2 or type 5 breeding, or all of them?
Oh, it all depends. Yeah, different types probably have different propensities for that, and that's kind of what I'm going to tackle here, actually. So type 2 and type 5, a little bit of a spoiler alert, they probably differ in the degree to which they do this.
Are you saying that the entire population migrates together and goes to another?
Not necessarily together. It's probably very dispersed, but they're in big flocks a lot of the time. And they definitely, like, information is moving between them and is probably helping them during these migrations. Maybe even between siskins or other crossbill types. And we know that from experimental work done by other people. So, and then here's an adaptive landscape that I blew up here from the key conifer hypothesis. Basically, there's a perfect build depth and group width given the distribution of conifers in the west. And there's these very discrete peaks that each crossbill has been driven to through evolution. That's that hypothesis, at least. And that is very much based on the Galapagos finch research, Grant and Grant, that basically showed that these Galapagos finches, there's mostly just brief periods of very strong selection that are driving them to these different species. So like in drought years, for example, you get this like heavy adaptation for seed, like annual seeds and stuff, and then that selects for this large bill morphology. And so that led to incredibly rapid speciation. And some of the Galapagos finches are kind of like crossbills, where it's like, it's an unclear whether they're a species or just a morphotype kind of thing. And it's all just a panmixia. But so a very similar system. And so that kind of inspired that work. But again, the rich patch exploiter hypothesis would suggest that it's the opposite, that they migrate and they don't have to survive through those fringe times regularly enough to force them not to adapt that way. So basically, I have some habitat selection results. And basically type 5 does seem to be reliably associated with lodgepole pine, both in summer and in winter. And other studies have found this as well. There have been 2 so far. And that is its key conifer. But type 5 does actually broaden its habitat use in winter, at least in the one study that's been done so far. So that's actually the opposite of the conifer hypothesis. Even though they're specialized to lodgepole pine somehow, clearly they're diversified, like they're not being driven to specialize as much as they're being driven to generalize when they get to the crunch time in late winter. or the supposed crunch time. And then on the other hand, type 2 has essentially no habitat preferences. Nobody's been able to find a consistent habitat selection trend for type 2. They just seem like incredibly generalist. So the habitat selection in type 5 is consistent with the habitat selection hypothesis and probably also the summer diet hypothesis. Habitat selection in type 2 opposes key conifer and habitat specialization hypotheses. And it's sort of how the key conifer hypothesis weighs in for type 5 is sort of equivocal from the habitat data, but perhaps actually opposing it. And here are some of my findings on habitat selection in type 2 and type 5. Only the top left is type 2. That's the only significant trend I could find for type 2. And basically, it's that they switch towards, they avoid lodgepole less in winter. They still don't love it, but they avoid it less in winter. So that's like not, I don't know. I don't think that's a slam dunk for anything really. But this study did find, or this, I'm sort of collaborating with this study. And we did find that the type 2 did decrease in abundance in winter in areas where there were no erosive pine. So that could actually suggest that they were fleeing to go to Ponderosa or something, looking for their key conifer. But that seems doubtful to me, given their very generalist disposition all the rest of the time. And then this shows that, yeah, type 5 broadens its habitat selection into winter. So as we get, the winter is the blue line, follows the red line. In winter, we get more selection for this Doug fir and spruce relative to summer, even though lodgepole pine is favored in both seasons. So this line, even though it's red, it's actually both seasons. They strongly select for lodgepole. Yeah, those are basically the results that I mentioned before. And then this is habitat selection during the nomadic migration period. So this is like early summer when they're all kind of moving around. There's no conifer seed on the landscape. They're between cone crops. And it's kind of a wish-wash. The only significant thing seems to be that, so I have soft cone conifers on the left. Those are Doug firs, spruces, things with that it's easy to pry the cones open, as opposed to lodgepole on the right, which is a harder cone. And on the left here, we can see that there's maybe a sort of a trend with type 5 not liking the soft cone conifers. But that's not super borne out in the lodgepole. You can see that the lowest density of lodgepole actually has a fair amount of type 5 usage. But there's probably something going on there with some preference for type 5 to lodgepole. And type 2, it's just like, seems like they like everything. I don't know. There's not really a pattern. But this is a significant, the difference between the highest and lowest soft cone cover canopy volumes for lodgepole was a significant difference. All right, so let's get on to some movement results. Basically, the seasonal nomadic migration that I was talking about, that mass movement, is very clear in type 2, but not so much in type 5. It seems like type 5 might just be switching between some local patches of resources. And type 2 is also very responsive to shifts in the resource abundance. So there's a strong correlation with the density of the insect resources. So basically there's time on X, and we can see red type 2, there's a giant peak, and then they go away, whereas type 5 is there throughout the whole summer. And this is last season's data. These aren't systematic counts. So I was following the crossbills as they sort of moved up slope, and that blurred that peak. But you can see that there's a peak there as well. And this perfectly overlaps with the peak budworm density, which is a primary food source that they're consuming during this time. And in fact, they're strongly correlated with that food source during the week of peak abundance. So that sort of suggests to me that at least type 2 is very much following the rich patch exploiter strategy, very responsive to changes in food abundance, and very migratory. Whereas type 5, not so much. Type 5 is probably, they're present in different habitats throughout the summer, and they're shifting between them, but they're not just leaving when it gets. All right, so feeding results, basically, yeah, there's a lot of this alternate food resource usage, especially insects, during that nomadic migration period. And then overall though, in terms of like throughout the annual cycle, summer, winter, there's incredibly similar diet between type 2 and type 5, as you would expect, given their almost identical bill size. So here's a bar chart showing some basically cumulative feeding minutes that I collected. This is in 2023. And you can see that there is a difference with type 2 at the top, feeding more on Engelmann spruce and Doug fir, but it seems like that's more of a habitat selection thing, not so much a food selection thing. Because when they're in aspen, they both are feeding heavily on the aspen two-leaf type, shown up at top left. And they both definitely are using both insect and seed resources. It does maybe seem like there's a difference in terms of type 5 using more seed, which would make sense if they have to survive the period after the insects crash, but before the next cone crop ripens, they might be perhaps surviving more on seed during that intermediate period. Yeah. So this kind of supports the rich patch hypothesis for both of them. And because these insect feeding findings are sort of novel for crossbills, there's basically people have always assumed that crossbills are these very intense conifer specialists. They probably, because of that crossbill, it's hard to actually imagine how they would be efficient foragers of insects. Like imagine more of a kinglet or warbler bill being more efficient at picking up insects than something like that, right? And so there have always been these sorts of occasional publications being like, oh, I saw them eating insects. Isn't that weird? But really, I think that it's not weird. I think that actually it's most of their diet during this period. And that's basically what I found.
Is that during the nesting seasons that when they're feeding you?
It's during the migration season, before they find their cone crop. They only actually start breeding once they find that cone crop and can get the really basically just unlimited resource of conifer cones. And that's when they start singing and then initiating nesting. There's probably, in type 5 though, I think that they are using this to initiate nesting early. So before the ecological cones are fully ripened, I think that they're actually breaking into these insect resources to pull back their nesting season and get those young fledged earlier. I don't have a lot of evidence for that. I just have a few very, very early type 5 fledglings during a year when there was basically no cone crop for them to be consuming. So yeah, so I think that there's an element to that in breeding, but I think that it's mostly a migration resource. And so here's one such resource. So these are the male cones of a ponderosa pine. And you can see this crossbill splitting it open, just grabbed a sawfly larva and swallowed it. And it's leaving the cones intact. So there had been a few reports of, people had mentioned that crossbills could be consuming staminate cones to bridge this gap period in summer when all the seeds from the last year have fallen and the new ones haven't ripened yet. But there hadn't been any like good evidence that they eat conifer or the male cones. So when I saw this, I thought, oh, there it is. Like they're eating the male cones of the conifer. But actually, when I got this closer look, hopefully, there we go. Oops. Yeah, you can see that they're actually not, they're just splitting the cones open to access the grub inside.
Yeah.
See that? And it does some more of them at the end, but I don't think I can just skip straight to the end. And this is actually a male crossbill. So like house finches, crossbills have yellow males too, but the males have a yellow throat instead of a white throat. See that? But yeah, so this is the food source that they're using. Basically, there's this little mine inside of each of these staminate cones, and inside of that, there's a sawfly larva. Very small little larva. And incidentally, I keyed out this sawfly larva. I've searched, and it's Sciella is the genus. I searched Sciella crossbill, and there had actually been another observation of feeding on this, but it was just from this like incredibly obscure report of the gut contents of a bunch of random birds that were shot on like Point Reyes. And they shot like 3 crossbills that had these things in them. And they were like, oh, Sciella. So it was from like the 1930s. Yeah, and it was almost the exact same date. Like I think it was within a week of this date. All right, and then this is a juvenile crossbill. You can see it's all streaky like that, and the mandible tips have started to cross. But it's on an aspen, obviously, not a conifer, which was a surprise to me. He's got a 2-week time. He's got a little grub. And he caught this grub. I don't need to narrate that. Pre-narrated. They can be really, and on these little aspen twigs, they can get really clumsy. It's just so fun to watch them climb around. Just thinking something. So the 2-leaf tire basically is tying together the aspen leaves like 2 pancakes and makes a little house inside. And so it's protected from most birds, but you can see not really crossbills. They just scissor the leaves apart from each other and then yank out the grub. So in some ways, they're actually better equipped for getting these gall forming or leaf tying insects than like a kinglet or a warbler. Did we ever see warblers attacking these? I don't think so. Siskins definitely do. Pine grosbeaks do. Black-headed grosbeaks do. But yeah, we never saw evening grosbeak either. When they grow on anti-ton midgets. But yeah. So
sorry, did you see a correlation between the birds that were eating Pinus contortus in serotinous versus non-serotinous cones?
Yeah, serotiny is really interesting in this region because there's a lot of sort of like variation in how serotinous the lodgepoles are around there. Mostly it's open cone, but there are patches of high serotiny, and every few trees there's a serotinous cone, meaning the cone stays closed until a fire opens it. And crossbills can't access serotinous cones. They can't break them open. They're just too tight. But it probably is providing a slight resource pulse during summer when the sun heats up a few of those really, really old cones that are starting to weaken, and a few of the scales pop open. And there's maybe a couple of seeds that are accessible during that time. Maybe. Like I can almost not even find one, but I did find like one. It's their whole job to find these things. So probably crossbills are using that to some extent, but I think that it's probably minimal. But yeah, lodgepole pine, fascinating tree species. There's so much variation in like whether they hold their cones, whether they open, whether they stay closed, and yeah, it's great. But yeah, so here's basically the insect they're going for. I pulled apart the 2 leaves and you can see there's the silken house, and then there's this big juicy grub inside called the aspen 2-leaf tire. There's another one. This is western spruce budworm, which is probably one of the most abundant insects in North America, if not the world. It just defoliates vast areas of forest. And so you can see all these tips are all chewed up and they look sort of gnarled. And this male crossbill is just probing around. And basically you can see kind of where the budworm has subtly tied together the needles. And he's just going and probing apart those needles and licking out the little budworm. So you can see. And parts it and then grabs the budworm. And so this insect is not very well defended. So basically every bird can eat them and does eat them. But crossbills are actually perfectly adept at eating them. And the intake rates per unit are not quite as high as they are for seeds. Crossbills are much quicker at getting seeds, but budworm is about 5 times bigger than a seed in terms of dry mass, but lower fat, higher protein. So I have yet to do the nutritional like analyses on the samples that I took, but I suspect it's going to come out to be more calories per minute budworm than for seed during this time. And they have these incredibly dexterous like tongues too, which they use to extract the seed, but they also very much use them to lap out the little caterpillar. Raven in the background. All right, so yeah, this is a close-up of a budworm in the same species. This is in a spruce and this is in a spruce branch. And they have this really distinctive spotting pattern. All right, so what's the significance of all this insect food usage? It seems maybe like, okay, well, maybe they're just still specialized on conifers and occasionally use insects. And we need to understand that, we kind of need to think back to this annual cycle of crossbills and the cones they rely on. So every year, basically, the cones of conifers, so between the 2 crossbill years, they're going to be bridging this gap between the end of winter, beginning of spring, where they're getting the last few seeds out of these open cones. And as the first warm days of summer come, that'll reopen those cones and drop those last few seeds. So then they'll just be like, they'll be out of luck on that. And they're trying to find another cone crop. So that's what the developing cones look like in July. And they can break into those big old cones and pull the developing seeds out. But they need to basically get between those. And conifers do this thing called masting, where they all produce seeds at the same time across a huge area. And so like, this is the range of ponderosa pine. It's completely normal to say have a really good cone crop one year on the Colorado Plateau. And maybe crossbills bred on that cone crop, maybe bred twice if they're lucky. And then spring comes and they're running out of seeds, they've reopened, and they're looking for those. It might be that the next cone crop might be in the Eastern Cascades. It could be really far away. And so basically, how do they bridge all of this area that doesn't have any cones from last year, doesn't have any cones developing? And yeah, these insects are probably that bridge. So basically giving them a food source with which to cover that gap. And so this is sort of the thing that facilitates the rich patch exploiter hypothesis, basically, is that there's the alternative food sources that they're very efficient at foraging on that bridge these 2 cone cycles. All right. I think I had another image here. Anyway, basically, I found this one article that published some basically analysis of the nitrogen content, the protein content of conifer seeds. And it happened to be from the exact same USDA climate zone as my field site, which was really nice. And basically conifer seeds don't get to their, they don't accumulate most of their protein until basically the beginning of August. And so the insect populations that I was surveying crashed in the middle of July. So there could be, this also might support the summer diet hypothesis, like maybe they've gotten to this new food source, but it's incredibly low profitability. Like maybe just half of the protein content that it normally has, and extra difficult to extract. So that could support this combination of evidence could support the key conifer hypothesis and summer diet hypothesis at the same time. All right. So, and then in terms of conifer seed usage, diet, we can see that this is use versus availability, pretty much how much they select for something. The use is in black, the availability is in gray, and pretty much type 2, type 5, they're the same. They strongly avoid lodgepole pine. They eat spruce about proportional to how much spruce there is, and they really like Douglas fir. And there's a big Doug fir crop. This is from 1 year though, so varies year to year. But we do see that there is more, so like, even though they are strongly avoiding it, type 5 does use lodgepole pine more. So there's some element of lodgepole pine specialization that's playing in here. So overall, it seems like type 2 and type 5 are probably behaviorally isolated by different mechanisms for each of them. So type 5 is probably isolated by both having the less rich patch exploiting strategy, the more resident, more strongly specialized strategy. And there's probably some rich patch, or there's probably some key conifer element that's selecting for that lodgepole pine specialization, at least when other things fail. So like when Doug fir fails, when spruce fails, then they're probably starting to specialize on lodgepole. But that's probably only in about a quarter to a half of the year. So is that enough to really call them a lodgepole specialist? Maybe. But in type 2, on the other hand, they're very much not a ponderosa pine specialist. They eat just about everything, and they're probably isolated from type 5 and other more sedentary types by this migratory behavior. So most years they're going to be breeding separately. And then when they do breed, there's going to potentially be a loss to hybridization by having this weird intermediate phenotype. So we call that more of an obligate opportunist strategy in type 5 and a rich patch exploiter strategy in type 2. Whether these initially drove them to separate or whether they're just maintaining the isolation, that's more debatable. But we do know that type 2 is very generalist, so there's no diet mechanism that should be isolated on. So red squirrels are more like the type 5 strategy. I threw that red squirrel image up there because yeah, they're a conifer specialist, but they still can survive through periods with no conifer seed by being really generalist in terms of the breadth of things they eat. In fact, they're actually, you could call them a fungal, like truffle and mushroom specialist during a lot of summers. That's mostly what they rely on. So here's some literature that I cited for this presentation. And I'd like to acknowledge these funders. And yeah, you can email me. Obviously, this is a small group, so you can just ask me if you have any questions. But yeah, thank you.
How far along are you? Where would you say you are in your?
Maybe a third. Yeah, so I still have to take my qualifying exam this December.
No.
And that's very stressful. And then after that, I have to do my other kind of 2 chapters of research, which I've sort of just selected. I think that I'm going to do a bunch of like maybe call development and learning stuff, and potentially more like feeding rate based information or feeding rate based data for crossbills, where I take more of those videos, try to make them better, and take more videos of crossbills and extract feeding rates through the year to see when they're most limited, basically, to test, partially to test these hypotheses, but also others. And I see that taking me another probably 3 years, but yeah. Yeah. Any other cross? Yeah, Zane?
Does it surprise you that if type 2 are generalists, they are being more migratory? Because intuitively, it seems like a generalist could stay in the same area around and stay on different things.
Yeah, yeah, it does seem like that would be one way to look at it for sure. And type 5 in a way is also very generalist in that it has to be able to switch to any of the things in its range. Although it also happens to be the case that type 5 lives in an area where the alternative resources are fairly small seeded, so it might select for the same thing. Let me think. So what would prevent, basically you're asking, Zane just, oh, I should repeat the question for Zane. Zane just asked basically, what would prevent type 2 from being a more resident species, given that it has such a broad diet? And I think the answer to that is nothing. There are a lot of resident populations of type 2, or not necessarily, we don't know that they're resident. There's no evidence tracking these things. They're too small. But like in the Sierra, there are type 2 every year. In Southern California, there's type 2 every year. In parts of New Mexico and Arizona, there's type 2 every year. So I think that partially as you go south, you get more consistency of resources, and you also get less of a energetic demand in winter. And so I think that allows some amount of sedentary activity, but basically winter is the step that's going to force them to leave. Even if you're an incredible generalist, all these insects are going to be gone in winter. They're probably not really going to be able to, do like what a tree sparrow or a junco does and really sift through the dirt and find seeds. Like they need something that's either a conifer seed or is really easy to eat. And so in most of the temperate North America, that limits them to conifer seed, and conifer seeds have that incredibly cyclic nature. So even if you're maybe the Sierras and Cascades are probably some of the best in terms of conifer diversity. At best, 3, 4 co-occurring good conifers that hold seed into winter. And most years they aren't going to overlap in the co-crop. So yeah, I think that they kind of like lodgepole is probably serving to stabilize type 5 to some extent in terms of range. Yeah, you got a question.
Great. My mind's getting into it so bad. I noticed in your availability versus utilization graph, that you did include Pinus ponderosa.
That's because at my study site, there's no Pinus ponderosa.
Okay.
Yeah, and yet there is lots of type 2 every single year.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and so that suggests that Pinus ponderosa may be not critical, but in this year they did leave mostly. So in winter. So
with a higher prevalence for pseudosudomanthii type 5.
yeah, for type 5, which is actually counter to what you would expect given the key conifer hypothesis, because Pseudosugum and ZCI has actually a much larger seed than either the lodgepole pine or the Engelmann spruce, much larger than lodgepole pine. And so the whole husking grooves being narrower in the bill for type 5, which is the primary explanation for why they're specialized for lodgepole, doesn't really line up there. Like they seem to do just fine. Oh, sorry.
Konshau, and you or Craig or Tom been looking at sort of climate projections and
Yeah.
Range dispersal over time? Can you just repeat your question?
Oh, okay. So basically the question was that whether me or my advisor Tom or Craig Bankman at University of Wyoming, that basically was published everything that there is on crossbills, is considering any effects of climate in terms of shifting their ranges or causing this life history strategy to change. Is that the question? Yeah, and so there is a paper by Craig, or at least by Craig's lab, that I believe discusses this. And yeah, we would expect basically if you get more warm winters and especially warm springs, basic fall through spring, anytime in there, if you get warm days that are unexpected, their seeds are going to drop. And so that is going to increase the number of years where this facultative movement / eruption stage might have to take place. They don't want to have to do this. Like if they can help it, they just want to breed and then breed again. And so it could really mess up their life history or their life history strategy if they're in fact these rich patch exploiters. If this is true, then yeah, it could really mess them up to have more warm days fall through spring. Is that what's actually projected? I think that in California it is, but I'm not sure about the Pacific Northwest where this would be more pressing given the number of different call types up there. In California, I think that our the more resident type twos that we have in the Sierra and Southern California ranges, they're probably going to make do with whatever, but it's really really anyone's guess. But the argument is that, yeah, there is an effect, there's a threat of climate change because of this.
The prevalence of barn beetles or fires.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's just basically breaking up the patches of even possible habitat for a cone crop in the first place. But given that they can cross in the entire like these really nomadic ones, at least like type 2, type 4, type 3, they can cross like the entire Western United States. I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to be a barrier to them. It might be more of a threat for the more resident types like type 9, the Red Crossbill. They really got messed up by a large fire that burned like a huge fraction of the tiny little range. Or if there is more cryptic diversity in type 2 that's sedentary, they might get displaced by fire. Type 6, the Sierra Madre crossbill, potentially, since they're much more resident, you would expect them to be more displaced by fire. But for these really nomadic types, it's a little hard for me to see how fire would be like the end of the line for any of them. In fact, sometimes after the Yellowstone fires, 88, I believe, all of those open logical cones basically facilitated this huge invasion of crossbills. But it was just a flash in the pan, and they all have to leave and do something else once those seeds go away. That's the serotinous cones again, close until they get heated up, so that you can end up with like a giant cone crop, unlike anything you would ever see in a normal year if you get a fire in a logical forest. But it is something that I've thought about, but isn't directly related to the research I do, I guess. Yeah. Anyone else?
Well, I'm trying to, my mind remember back to the range map, but I think maybe like to like off. They all the way to the eastern.
So there is a weird division where there's only the eastern United States has way less crossbill types than the western United States. And that's probably because of just the kind of the distribution of conifers in the eastern US. There's not like solid conifer forests across huge areas in most of the east. I mean, once you get into the boreal forest, there is, but the boreal forest basically all the way to British Columbia is not great for crossbills because jack pine and white spruce both are really good at dropping all their seeds in fall. And so if you're a crossbill, they might be good for that summer breeding stage, but you're like, you can count on not having anything through winter, which is going to make you migrate a really long way.
So the type 2, you guys get all of these, just not to the south.
Yeah, even though the southeast is full of different pine species, great pine diversity in the southeast. There's apparently the cone phenologies don't work out such that there's seed through that winter period as well. And so crossbills generally avoid the southeast as well. The southeast does have, so all of this is like eruptive range for type 2, none of it is core range. There's some, I think, in the east every year, basically, but some years there's like a giant invasion, and some years there's very few. So this is mostly eruptive range. The East Coast only has type 1 in the Appalachians, which is more or less maybe sort of resident in the Appalachians, but there are records going all the way out to Washington. Maybe they get mixed up with the incoming type 2 flocks and then return back with them, who knows. And then type 12 is the northeastern type. That's like sort of the New England and Quebec. That's also probably like a very generalist type that just switches between several locally abundant resources. I think, is it red pine, jack pine, and currently, oh, and Japanese black pine is a huge food source in the Northeast, which is introduced, but there's that. Yeah, the introduced conifers in the East have really increased the availability of crossbill food there probably. Oh, there's also Norway spruce, which is like maybe the best crossbill tree of all. And that's just planted all over the East. So it's kind of weird. It's hard to know what it was like before all of those conifers were planted there, but there's probably two more or less Eastern types, plus Newfoundland has an endemic call type that's an island isolated one that maybe on its way to extinction. Red squirrels were introduced there and that messed everything up. So yeah, it's interesting that the West has so much more diversity, and it's probably to do with more conifer diversity, and critically, there's more of those conifers that hold seed in the winter.
Just wondering, on any given year, how much overlap is there between call types in breeding ranges, and maybe the way we think about it is maybe how like isolation is there from each population.
Yeah, and breeding as opposed to like when they're in an eruptive kind of non-breeding winter phase.
I'm thinking about the breeding rate, and I'm actually really wondering how well interbreeding understood between the different call types.
Yeah, so Ryan just asked whether basically there's to what extent the types overlap during their breeding versus non-breeding periods, and whether assortative mating has been studied extensively. And there is some, so basically the only species or the only type of crossbill where assortative mating has been rigorously studied is the Konshau crossbill, type 9, which is endemic to the South Hills of Idaho. It's easy to study because it's resident. And that's why we have Konshau crossbill, is because people like Bankman and his lab could get down there every year and like find pairs, record the pairs, like confirm breeding, and then get a big enough sample size to convince the AOU that in fact they do not breed with each other, even when there's overlap. That hasn't really been done extensively for the other types. And that's not for lack of overlap in breeding. It's mostly for lack of a consistent field site to go to. So like in the Cascades in Washington, you could probably expect pretty frequent overlap of type 4 and type 3 in a lot of areas. And that nobody's ever studied the degree to which they interbreed, partially because it's so hard to find nests and pairs, especially in the Pacific Northwest where the forests are absurdly tall. And yeah, and it's just like you'll get 1 year of great data, and then you come back next year, it'll be one type or no types, and you're out of luck. So, but Matt Young in New York, I think he told me that they went around citing, obvious pairs of crossbills, and it really seemed to him as though all of the types were pairing assortatively with their own type. Even and that's in a year when there's a bunch of different types that are all erupting to the Northeast, all breeding in the same resource in the same place, which is very common. So yeah, basically, no, we don't know about assortative mating really. The evidence that exists suggests that there's high assortative mating within type, and they do breed in the same place on the same resource all the time. That's incredibly common.
Not much evidence that your types are interbreeding.
No, not much. There are reports for sure. Even in Konshau crossbill, there were a few. But yeah, there's very high, like 95, 98% at least assortative mating rates. But we do know from genetic evidence that there's still tons of gene flow. Like this PCA makes it look very clean, but the phylogeny that was published with that PCA was just a mess. It was like no monophyletic groups for any of the crossbill types except for type 6, which is the Sierra Madre. Actually, I don't think that was strictly monophyletic, but it was close. And type 9, which was, several dozen samples, all from the exact same mountain in the exact same crossbill population. So I wasn't shocked to see that resolved as monophyletic. I think you could probably take a bunch of birds from one population anywhere and they'll resolve as monophyletic. But yeah, but we know that there's gene flow. They are hybridizing enough to where genetically, they don't look like species. But that's also true of plenty of Galapagos or several Galapagos finches where they're not behaving as phylogenetic species, but they're very much biological species. They're not hybridizing at high rates. They have completely different ecological associations. So it's a really murky complex. And yeah, this is not, since I'm not a taxonomist or phylogeneticist, I'm not really tackling these questions of like, exactly what do we call these? And I don't envy the person who eventually does. Because yeah, like I said, genetic evidence so far shows that it's a mess. Anyone else?
If you were in a situation where you had a whole bunch of crossbills, say in a museum and nobody ever put any information down except their crossbills, they don't know where they came from. Did you go in there and classify all those birds just on morphology as to which species?
No, I wish. Which type?
Yeah.
Yeah, no. Even though there's these here, even though there's the like this shows, you can see the difference between type 3 and type 6 is huge. Like it's hard to imagine that they're even the same species. It almost seems ridiculous that they're the same species, type 3 and type 6, because there's so much size difference. But despite that, each of the distributions of their sizes and bill sizes do overlap a fair amount. I think type 6 actually you could tell. So, and you would know because it was collected in the Sierra Madre. They don't really show up very far from there. But there's also type 2 in the Sierra Madre. So it could be a challenge even because they're the closest in terms of bill depth. But yeah, you could get suspicions, but probably just for the upper and lower ends. And even then, it would be really hard to argue that you have definitively this. And this is one reason why the typology in crossbills is all messed up, is because in the 1800s, people saw all this variability and they were like, ooh, subspecies. And so they described all of these subspecies that were just bogus. They were like not based on, they just drew the line basically where most other birds have a line. So like, they were like, this one is different, the Rocky Mountains and the Sierras, because, like junco like that. Well, juncos even don't really have it's the same group, but different subspecies in like the Pacific Northwest and the Sierra. Anyway, so they drew all these subspecies out and designated type specimens, but of course they didn't record any of them. They didn't say anything about what any of them sounded like. And so if we wanted to describe any of these types as a new species or a new subspecies, we wouldn't be able to use any of the existing type material or any of the existing subspecies nomenclature because it's all based on unrecorded birds that could have been anything. Because depending on what kind of econe year it was, even if you're in Colorado in a lodgepole pine forest, and it really seems like type 5 is probably what it is based on morphology, like type 2 could if it's depending on the year, type 2 could also be breeding in that exact habitat. So you're even type 4 if there's a good Dougford crop. So it's really like, it's difficult to use those specimens. But yeah, yes.
I don't know where kind of basic much of other type numbers, like the order they were described, I believe it's more like.
That's the order that Jeff Groth found them. So Groth, 1993. He worked at the American Museum is that in Washington? It's in the East Coast somewhere. And I think he was studying his first paper actually on crossbills just deals with type 1 and type 2, and that they don't, which are perhaps some of the most similar sounding types. And so he actually found the two most similar ones to be different just on the East Coast, and then went to the West and was like, oh my gosh, there's all these other ones. And that 93 it's actually like a University of California Press like book, very small book, but it's just awesome. He has such amazing sample sizes and really does due diligence in terms of like showing exactly what kind of morphological space each one of them occupies and exactly what kind of variation there is in the calls. It's really great work, but yeah, it's just the order that he found them. So, and he only got to 8. So I think I have this figure back here. 8. So that's the Newfoundland crossbill. And then type 9 was discovered by Craig Bankman in the South Hills. And he, just added 9 to that. And then type 10 was discovered by Irwin in Humboldt County. That's a Western Birds article, 10. And then 11. So 11, they're described by sound only. 11 is Central American, which is, it's based on very few, almost no recordings, just a few recordings showing that clearly something very different is going on in Central America and that it deserves at least one other call type. And then 12 is the northeastern one. That is very similar to type 10, but doesn't, it's type 10 is Sitka spruce, coastal Pacific Northwest, and type 10 Eastern was like consistently in the East. And so people kind of realized that something had to be going on. And then closer audio spectrographic analysis showed that, yeah, type 10 does have this consistent, or type 10 Eastern, now type 12, has this consistent, like consistently different call profile. I think at least it has a more of a rising component to the beginning, like a sharp, like rise and then two. But yeah, it's kind of fun that we have these numbers. Unfortunately, it does make it difficult to sort of market them as recognizable species. And so I think that that's why Clements added the conifer species names to them, is because we needed something sort of to give it a human name so that people will at least be able to remember what the sound is to the bird. Because like, I don't know, before I started studying these, I was just like, there's a bunch of numbers, like, how am I gonna, yeah, it just is hard to remember the call and attach it to the number, because that's not really how I think most people think. But yeah, for some of them, we have to use a geographic designation because there's no knowledge on any kind of conifer usage. And for the ones that do have a conifer name attached to their name, I think we should revisit that. But yeah. Any more questions?
Fascinating.
Will you have to communicate all the call types as you?
Oh, unfortunately, maybe I'll ask them to actually ask me that, just so I can like, yeah. No, unfortunately, my QE is not very study system focused. It's more general ecology and behavior focused. And so they'll ask me probably much less interesting than this. Like, what's the